In a 42 to 22 vote, Colorado House members approved its own version of the 2018-19 budget this week. The long bill from the House contains a variety of amendments that are not likely to make it out of the Senate Appropriations Committee, which is where the bill is headed to next. Patty, approving the budget is the biggest job our legislature has every year, but we often hear about the long bill, a lot of different details, and this time we have two pretty different versions. What version do you think is going to be the one that looks most like the final one that we see approved later this session?
Neither. There's going to be plenty of fights going on. There were 95 amendments made in the House on Wednesday, and they wound up putting some of them in. One of them is the interesting idea of the $500 million of the $28.5 billion that's going to be earmarked for transportation. The compromise was a really interesting one from the Democrats, say, let municipalities take charge of it. Maybe they can build their own light rail lines. Maybe we can move along to those 119 miles before 2020. That's unlikely to survive in the Senate. We also have the compromise on $35 million going to school security. We already have more going to education, but I think probably some of that money could certainly be used better going to education rather than a security plan that I'm guessing will be some kind of boondoggle. We've got to go through the Senate now. That's going to be a big place to fight over a lot of these compromises.
David, 6 House Republicans sided with the Democrats to pass this budget. Now it heads over to the Senate, and the news in the Senate was the budget that that got out of there last week was a Democratic plan that a couple Republicans sided to make it happen. Do you think the final version of the budget is going to look a bit more Democratic?
Well, I think as Penfield can explain from a lot of personal knowledge, the long bill for funding the state government in general that eventually gets passed almost always is very, very, very similar to the long bill as created by the Joint Budget Committee. And as that bill moves through the rest of the legislature, things get added and subtracted. But by the time it's all done, it's very little difference from what the Joint Budget Committee of 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, all budget experts, proposes. It's unfortunate that we still have in this bill the Hollywood welfare provision. That's by which the taxpayers of Colorado gave Harvey Weinstein $3 million. And who can think of somebody more deserving of your taxpayer money than Harvey Weinstein?
Harvey Weinstein. I mean, that's a little bit of a stretch.
He's the producer of The Hateful Eight, which we gave $5 million to in Colorado, violating the film board's own regulations.
Did Miramax produce The Hateful Eight, or was it the Weinstein Company?
I guess I will look it up. Harvey Weinstein is on the credits of Hateful Eight.
Okay, all right, fair enough.
Okay. $35 million for school security grants is a great idea because there's lots of ways to spend money on education, but keeping students alive during the school day is about the highest possible one. And at Arapahoe High School, when there was a school resource officer, a sheriff's deputy, on the scene when a criminal came onto the property with a gun and started attacking people, 1 life was lost because the deputy courageously, opposite of the cowardly guy in Broward County, Florida, immediately engaged and stopped the killer and saved many lives. Simultaneously in the Senate, a separate bill, they passed unanimously a bill to ask the voters for approval for $3.5 billion in funding for transportation improvements. That is an important sign, and the unanimity from the Senate puts some pressure on the Democratic leadership of the House, which has essentially had the point of view that no, transportation, that's an extra thing. If you want to raise your taxes, you little people, you can go and do that. But the state budget core is certainly not for funding things like transportation. It's for Medicaid and the teachers' unions.
Penn, as David alluded, you have experience with this. You're a former state lawmaker. You've seen it from all different angles. What should we take away from the headlines about the House version this week, and what should we expect as we get closer to the end of the session?
Don't take much away from the House version of the bill. What will happen is the House passed its version of the bill. There were 90-some amendments offered. 33 amendments got on. But the context is the budget is $30 billion this year. I think all the amendments combined came in around 300, 400 million. So you're talking about 0.1% of the overall budget. It'll go to the Senate now, where the Senate will have its own share of amendments, kill a number of the House amendments, and it'll go into conference committee, and the conference committee is the JBC. So the JBC will get the bill in conference committee. The bill will go back to looking much like the bill the JBC initially introduced, everybody will wring their hands, argue, fuss, and fight, and they'll pretty much pass the bill that the JBC wrote with a few exceptions. And normally those exceptions are those matters where you have bipartisan support in both chambers for the change. And so what's going to happen now is Democrats running the House will start talking with Republicans running the Senate and start figuring out what items they will agree on, so that when the conference committee meets, they'll have a pretty good idea of what the bill is, because they'll recommend that version to both sides. The transportation amendment is interesting because, as David alluded to, we've got Senate Bill 1 coming through, but it also did something very interesting. It created a carve-out so that the chamber could run its initiated measures this cycle, and if those aren't successful, certain things happen. I'm not convinced that carve-out's going to remain. And the amendment in the House that gave some of the money, transportation money, directly to local governments is pretty controversial, because usually you don't see state money go directly to local governments for transportation fixes, because counties and cities have their own ability to tax and spend, and so the state normally doesn't directly subsidize that. So you may see that in all likelihood roll out, because that impacts the larger transportation funding effort.
John, it seems that one of the few issues that Coloradans from around the state can agree upon is the need for better transportation roads. Do you think we'll see some sort of solution in this year's budget?
Well, I mean, the first request is for $495 million, so you would think that they would. I think one of the interesting aspects was the pension for para, to help bail out some of the workers that have lost money over the years because of bad investments by para and that kind of thing. You know, we had revenue growth this year, so everybody was fighting over these dollars, and so now that the Democrats have the edge, perhaps we won't see the same kind of thing we saw, you know, a few years back when we had a surplus and Owens came in and said, just because the president's given rebates, I'm going to give rebates in the state, at the state level. Tagging on to what Penn said about transportation going to local government, money going to local governments, I think where it gets confused is like in Denver, where you have US 40 running, you know, as Colfax, and then you have, 285 going through the city. You also have, you know, other 40 going through the city. So the bottom line is, state comes in and has to do those because those are federal roads. So that's where it gets kind of confusing, and maybe some of that money goes to that effort.